Today we will talk about industrial America, and this particular lecture has two parts, so listen to this and then look for the second part. Today we will start our lecture with a story. It's the story of Andrew Carnegie. In January 1901, Andrew Carnegie became the world's richest man when he sold his steel corporation to financier J.P. Morgan. An immigrant from Scotland who came to the United States in 1848 at the age of 13, Carnegie first toiled in a boiler room of a Pittsburgh trade factory and quickly worked his way up the economic ladder. Along with his grit and determination, his control over new technologies served as a key to his rapid success. Carnegie mastered Morse code and working as a telegraph messenger so impressed a powerful superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad that he hired Carnegie at age 17. Carnegie soon calculated that the nation's rapid westward expansion required oil, iron, railroad bridges, and an even more extensive telegraph system. All industries in which he successfully invested and reaped a huge fortune. To some Americans, Carnegie served as a proof of the American dream, the opportunity in the United States to rise from rags to riches. To others, he epitomized a cruel and exploitative system that diminished upward social mobility. Carnegie's workers labored in dangerous and brutal 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, for low wages, barely enough to eke out a living in the grime and squalor of smoky, polluted steel towns. Moreover, his workers often paid a terrible price for Carnegie's implementation of new technology. Not only did machines replace men, but experimental technologies often resulted in injury and death. Andrew Carnegie's story reflects the massive changes that the United States underwent in the last quarter of the 19th century. Between 1870 and 1905, the nation's economy quadrupled in size. Americans had access to more and cheaper goods than any other time in human history. The late 19th century was an energetic era of inventions. Building upon mid-century industrial revolution in Great Britain, as well as answering the increasing call from Americans for efficiency and comfort, the country found itself in the grip of invention fever. In retrospect, harnessing the power of steam and then electricity in the 19th century vastly increased the power of man and machine, thus making other advances possible as the century progressed. Facing an increasingly complex everyday life, Americans sought the means by which to cope with it. Inventions often provided the answers. To understand the scope of this zeal for creation, consider the US Patent Office, which in 1790, its first decade of existence, recorded only 276 inventions. By 1860, the same office had issued a total of 60,000 patents. But between 1860 and 1890, that number exploded to nearly 4,500,000, with another 235,000 in the last decade of the century. Now we will discuss a few sectors which saw a huge boom during the late 19th century in the United States, and we'll start with steel, then move on to telegraph, and then we'll talk about telephones. Let's start with steel. The late 19th century witnessed a major shift in the nature of industrial production. Early factories concentrated on producing textile clothing and leather products. After the Civil War, a second industrial revolution resulted in the growth of large-scale industry and the production of steel, petroleum, electric power, and industrial machinery to produce other goods. Perhaps the most important industrial advancement of that era came in the production of steel. Manufacturers and builders preferred steel to iron due to its increased strength and durability. After the Civil War, two new processes allowed for the creation of furnaces large enough and hot enough to melt iron needed to produce large quantities of steel at lower prices. The Bessemer process, named after English inventor Henry Bessemer, and the open heart process changed the way the United States produced steel, and in doing so led the country into a new industrialized age. As the new material became more available, builders eagerly sought it out, a demand that steel mill owners were happy to meet. In 1860, the country produced 13,000 tons of steel. By 1879, American furnaces were producing over 1 million tons per year. By 1900, this figure had risen to 10 million. Just 10 years later, the United States was the top steel producer in the world at over 24 million tons annually. As production increased, to match the overwhelming demand, the price of steel dropped by over 80%. When quality steel became cheaper and more readily available, other industries relied upon it more heavily as a key to their growth and development, including construction and later the automotive industry. As a result, the steel industry rapidly became the cornerstone of American economy, remaining the primary indicator of industrial growth and stability through the end of Second World War. There was also improvement in the communication sector. As early as 1774, inventors had been trying to create a system to send messages electronically. In 1837, two separate telegraph systems were patented in the United States, one of which used needles to point to letters of the alphabet and one used a combination of dots and dashes tapped onto paper by a stylus, which was controlled by an electromagnet. The second system, invented by Samuel F.B. Morse and his assistant Alfred Vail, subsequently became the most popular telecommunication device for sending messages using the alphabet of dots and dashes known as Morse code. In 1851, a conference of European countries officially adopted Morse code as the method for international communications. In 1858, British and American crews laid the first transatlantic telegraph cable lines, enabling messages to pass between the United States and Europe in a matter of hours, rather than waiting for a few weeks it could take for a letter to arrive by steamship. Although these initial cables worked for barely a month, they generated great interest in developing a more efficient telecommunications industry. Within 20 years, over 100,000 miles of cable crisscrossed the ocean floors, connecting all the continents. Domestically, Western Union, which controlled 80% of the country's telegraph lines, operated nearly 200,000 miles of telegraph routes from coast to coast. In short, people were connected like never before, able to relay messages in minutes and hours rather than days and weeks. One of the greatest advancements was the telephone, which Alexander Graham Bell patented in 1876. It worked by turning sound waves into an electrical signal, which was transmitted like a telegraph through a wire to another telephone. At first, they were impractical and could not be used over long distances. The first long-distance telephone line was built in 1877 and only reached 60 miles. The first phone call from east to west coast did not happen until 1915, and the first transatlantic call between the United States and Great Britain was not until 1927. However, Graham's technology was incredibly valuable and also hotly disputed. While he was not the first to invent the concept, Bell was the first one to capitalize on it. After securing the patent, he worked with financier and businessmen to create the National Bell Telephone Company. Western Union, which had originally turned down Bell's machine, went on to commission Thomas Edison to invent an improved version of the telephone. It is actually Edison's version that is most like the modern telephone used today. However, Western Union, fearing a costly legal battle they were likely to lose due to Bell's patent, ultimately sold Edison's idea to the Bell Company. With the communications industry now largely in their control, along with an agreement from the federal government to permit such control, the Bell Company was transformed into the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which still exists today as AT&T. By 1880, 50,000 telephones were in use in the United States, including one at the White House. By 1900, that number had increased to 1.35 million, and hundreds of American cities had obtained local service for their citizens. Quickly, technology was bringing the country into closer contact, changing forever the rural isolation that characterized vast regions of the country. Now we will move on to discuss Thomas Edison and electricity. In September 1878, Thomas Edison announced a new and ambitious line of research and development, electric power and lighting. The scientific principles behind dynamos and electric motors, the conversion of mechanical energy to electrical power and vice versa, were long known. But Edison applied the bureaucratic and commercial ethos to the problem. Far from being a lone inventor, gripped by inspiration toiling in isolation, Edison advanced the model of commercially minded management of research and development. Edison unfolded his two identities, business manager and inventor, together. He brought his fully equipped lab and skilled mechanists and scientists he employed to bear on the problem of building an electric power system and commercializing it. In 1879, Edison invented the item that led to his greatest fame, the light bulb. He explored over 6,000 different materials for the filament before stumbling upon tungsten as the ideal substance. By 1882, with financial backing largely from J.P. Morgan, he had created the Edison Electric Illuminating Company, which began supplying electrical current to a small number of customers in New York City. Morgan guided subsequent mergers of Edison's other enterprises, including a machine works front and a lamp company, resulting in the creation of the Edison General Electric Company in 1889. We will now talk about John Rockefeller and his contribution to the oil industry. John Rockefeller was born in 1839. When the Rockefeller family moved to the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio in 1853, he had an opportunity to take accounting and bookkeeping courses while in high school and developed a career interest in business. While living in Cleveland in 1859, he learned of Colonel Edwin Drake, who had struck black gold or oil near Pennsylvania. During this time, many sought to find a fortune through risky and chaotic drilling of exploratory oil wells, hoping to strike it rich. But Rockefeller chose a more certain investment, which was to refine crude oil into kerosene, which could be used for both heating and lamps. As a more efficient source of energy as well as less dangerous to produce, kerosene quickly replaced the well oil in many businesses and homes. Rockefeller worked initially with family and friends in the refining business located in the Cleveland area, but by 1870, Rockefeller ventured out on his own, consolidating his resources and creating the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. Initially, that was valued around $1 million. Rockefeller was ruthless in his pursuit of total control of the oil refining business. As other entrepreneurs flooded the area seeking a quick fortune, Rockefeller developed a plan to crush his competitors and create a true monopoly in the refining industry. Beginning in 1872, he forged agreements with several large railroad companies to obtain discounted rates for shipping his products. He also used the railroad companies to gather information on his competitors. As he could now deliver his kerosene at lower prices, he drove his competition out of business, often offering to buy them out for pennies on the dollar. He hounded those who refused to sell out to him until they were driven out of business. Through his method of growth via mergers and acquisitions of smaller and similar companies known as horizontal integration, his company, Standard Oil, grew to include almost all refineries in the area. By 1879, the Standard Oil Company controlled nearly 90% of all oil refining business in the country, as well as 90% of all oil refining businesses in the world. Seeking still more control, Rockefeller reorganized the advantages of controlling the transportation of his product. He began to grow his company through vertical integration, wherein a company handles all aspects of a product's life cycle, from the creation of raw materials to the production process to the delivery of the final product. In Rockefeller's case, this model required investment and acquisition of companies involved in everything from barrel making to pipelines, tankers, cars to railroad. He came to own almost every type of business and used his vast power to drive competitors from the market through intense price wars. Although vilified by competitors who suffered from his takeovers and considered him to be no better than a robber baron, several observers lauded Rockefeller for his ingenuity in integrating the oil refining industry and, as a result, lowering kerosene prices by as much as 80% by the end of the century. Unlike Carnegie and Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan was born to wealth and became much wealthier as an investment banker by making wise financial decisions in support of hardworking entrepreneurs building their fortunes. Morgan's father was a London banker, and J.P. Morgan the son moved to New York in 1857 to look after the family's business interests there. Once in the US, he separated from the London bank and created J.P. Morgan and Company financial firm. The firm bought and sold stock in growing companies, investing the family's wealth in those that showed great promise, thereby turning an enormous profit. Investment firms such as his were the key to the success stories of up-and-coming businessmen like Carnegie and Rockefeller. In return for his investment, Morgan and other investment bankers demanded seats on the company's boards, which gave them even greater control over policies and decisions than just the investment alone. There were many critics of Morgan and other bankers, particularly among members of the US Congressional Subcommittee, who investigated the control that financial firms had over key industries in the country. The subcommittee referred to Morgan's enterprise as a form of money trust that was even more powerful than the trust operated by Rockefeller and others. Morgan argued that his firms and others like it brought stability and organizational support to a hyper-competitive capitalist economy and linked his role to a kind of public service. Ultimately, Morgan's most notable investment and greatest consolidation was in the steel industry when he bought out Andrew Carnegie in 1901. Initially, Carnegie was reluctant to sell, but after repeated bargaining by Morgan, Carnegie named his price, an outrageously inflated sum of $500 million. Morgan agreed without hesitation and then consolidated Carnegie's holding with several smaller steel firms to create the US Steel Corporation. The US Steel was subsequently capitalized at $1.4 billion. It was the country's first billion-dollar firm.